You and your kids need to leave this unit within 48 hours, the man said without looking at me, like he had said it 100 times before, like it meant nothing. My youngest tightened her grip on my hand. My oldest stood quietly behind me holding a worn backpack, and I just nodded. I did not argue. I did not beg. I just said, okay. Because something about the way he said it felt wrong, not cruel, not even personal, just careless, like he had no idea who he was talking to. The hallway smelled like cheap carpet cleaner and last night's takeout, the same hallway I had walked through every single day for the past year after double shifts and late nights, carrying groceries, carrying exhaustion, carrying a life that never seemed to get lighter. I closed the door behind me slowly, hearing the lock click, and for a second I just stood there, keys in my hand, wondering how many times I had stood in that exact spot thinking I was safe. I wasn't. Not really. I turned to my kids and forced a small smile, the kind parents learn to make when they don't have answers. Just hold on, I said, we're going to be okay. And I meant it, even if I didn't know how yet. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of Texas afternoon that felt like rain but never delivered, and I loaded our 2 suitcases into the back of my 10-year-old Honda, the trunk barely closing over everything we owned that mattered. This wasn't the first time life had pushed me out of somewhere, and I had learned something the hard way over the years. Panic never paid the bills, and anger never built a future. So I stayed quiet. I drove. I thought. I had spent most of my 30s trying to survive, working as a waitress during the day, cleaning offices at night, picking up extra shifts whenever someone called out, chasing tips, chasing hours, chasing just enough to keep the lights on and the rent paid on time. Most months I made it. Some months I didn't. And when I didn't, people like him showed up with notices and deadlines and that same empty tone, like I was just another number on a list. But what he didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that my life hadn't just been about surviving for a long time. It had been about learning, quietly, slowly, in places no one paid attention to. 2 years ago, I had taken a job cleaning vacant units for a small property company. Nothing special, just scrubbing floors, wiping counters, getting apartments ready for the next tenant. But I listened. I watched. I learned how leases worked, how rent flowed, how buildings made money even when people inside them struggled. I learned words I had never paid attention to before: equity, ownership, shares, things that felt out of reach back then. And one night, after finishing a job, a woman from the office sat down next to me and asked if I had ever thought about investing. Just a small amount, nothing crazy, just enough to be part of something bigger. I laughed at first. Me invest. I was counting coins for gas some weeks. But she didn't laugh. She explained it simply: a group deal, shared ownership, low entry, long-term thinking. I didn't say yes right away. I went home and thought about it for weeks, running numbers in my head while washing dishes, while driving between jobs, while lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. And eventually I said yes, not because I felt ready, but because I was tired of always being on the outside of everything. I didn't realize then what that small decision would turn into. And as I sat in my car now, engine idling, my kids quiet in the back seat, that memory came back to me in a way it hadn't before, clear, sharp, and suddenly important, because something about today didn't add up, and for the first time in a long time, I had the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as powerless as he thought. We drove for almost 20 minutes before anyone spoke again, just the quiet hum of the engine and the soft sound of tires rolling over uneven pavement, and I kept my eyes on the road even though my mind was somewhere else entirely. Going back over every detail from that morning, every word, every tone, every small thing that did not feel right. My oldest finally broke the silence. "Mom, are we going to stay at Aunt Lisa's again?" And I felt that question settle deep in my chest, not because it was unreasonable, but because it meant this had happened enough times for them to expect it. "Not this time," I said gently, my voice steady even though I was still figuring it out myself. "We are going somewhere else first." I turned into a small parking lot near a grocery store, the kind with faded lines and a broken cart return, and parked the car under a tree that barely gave any shade. Then I shut off the engine and just sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app out of habit, knowing exactly what I would see. Just under $200. Not enough for a deposit anywhere. Not enough for a hotel more than a night or two. Not enough for mistakes. But this time, something felt different. Not easier, not safer, just different. Like there was a piece of the puzzle I had been ignoring. I closed the app and opened my email instead, scrolling through messages I usually ignored, promotions, receipts, reminders, things that had nothing to do with surviving the next week, until one subject line caught my attention again, something from months ago. Maybe longer, from the property company I used to clean for. I almost skipped it, thinking it was just another automated update, but then I remembered that conversation, that night after work when everything smelled like cleaning solution and empty rooms, when she sat next to me and explained how ownership did not always look the way people thought it did. I tapped the email and read it slowly this time, not like before when I barely understood half the terms, but carefully, line by line, letting each word settle in my mind. There it was again, the name of the company, the limited liability company structure, the list of participants, and something else I had never really paid attention to, a document attached. Something I had signed electronically without fully grasping what it meant back then. I opened it, zoomed in, and my eyes moved across the page until they stopped on a name I knew better than anyone, my own. For a second I thought I was misunderstanding it, reading it wrong, hoping for something that was not there, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. My name was listed as a member, a small percentage, nothing big, but not nothing either. I felt my heartbeat change, not faster exactly, but heavier, more deliberate, like my body was catching up to something my mind had just discovered. I leaned back in the seat and stared out through the windshield at the empty lot, thinking about the building, the units, the hallways I had cleaned, the doors I had walked past without thinking twice, and then about this morning, the notice, the man. The way he spoke like he had complete control over something that suddenly did not feel so simple anymore. I picked up my phone again, this time not to check money or messages, but to search, typing in the name of the company, scrolling through public records, property listings, anything I could find, and piece by piece, it started to come together in a way that made my hands go still. The address of the building appeared on the screen, followed by ownership details, and there it was again, the same company name, the same structure, the same connection I had just seen in that document. I did not say anything right away, not to my kids, not even out loud to myself. I just sat there letting the reality settle in, slow and steady, like something I had been building without realizing it was already built enough to matter. I did not start the engine again right away. I just sat there with my phone in my hand, reading the same lines over and over as if they might disappear if I blinked too fast. My name was still there, clear, unchanged, not a mistake, not a coincidence. A small percentage, yes, but real, legal, and tied to something much bigger than I had ever allowed myself to believe. For a long time, I had treated that investment like a distant idea, something I did because someone told me it might matter someday, not something that could change anything in my life now. But sitting there in that parking lot, with my kids waiting and nowhere certain to go, it stopped feeling distant. It felt immediate. It felt real. I opened another document attached to the email, this one more detailed, filled with numbers and terms that used to confuse me, but now I forced myself to slow down and understand every line, every clause, every condition. There were references to decision rights, to management structures, to responsibilities assigned to third-party operators, and that is when something else clicked into place, something I had not considered before. The man who told me to leave, he was not the owner. He was not even close. He was just the one hired to manage the place, to enforce rules, to collect rent, to act like authority without actually holding it. And somehow, he had decided that meant he could remove people without thinking twice. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the steering wheel, my thoughts becoming clearer with each passing second, not emotional, not reactive, just focused. I searched for the company again, this time digging deeper. Opening public filings, reading through names and roles, tracing connections between the management company and the ownership group. It took time, longer than I expected, but eventually I found what I was looking for: a list of members associated with the limited liability company, and again, there it was, my name, right alongside others I barely remembered. People who had likely moved on with their lives while I stayed busy trying to survive. I let out a slow breath, not relief exactly, but something close to understanding. This was not luck. This was not magic. This was something I had stepped into years ago without realizing how far it could reach. In the back seat, my youngest shifted slightly, her voice soft, "Mom, what are we doing now?" And I turned just enough to see both of them watching me, waiting, trusting that I had a plan even when I did not always know what that plan was. "We are going to take care of something first," I said calmly, and I meant it. I was not thinking about where we would sleep that night anymore, not yet, because something more important had come into focus, something that could change all of it if I handled it the right way. I opened my contacts and scrolled until I found a number I had not called in a long time, the woman from the property company, the one who had explained everything to me when I barely understood any of it. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I knew that once I made that call, things would start moving in a direction I could not ignore. Then I pressed it and held the phone to my ear, listening to it ring, each second stretching just enough to remind me how far I had come without noticing. When she answered, her voice familiar but slightly surprised, I introduced myself again, calmly, clearly, and there was a pause on the other end, a recognition that came through even without seeing her face. "I think there is something we need to talk about," I said, and as the words left my mouth, I realized this was the first time all day I did not feel like I was being pushed out of something. It felt like I was stepping into it instead. She did not ask many questions at first, just listened, and that told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was becoming. I explained the situation slowly, leaving out nothing: the notice, the timeline, the name of the manager, the way everything had been handled, and there was a shift in her tone that I could hear even without seeing her face. "That should not have happened," she said finally, "not like that, not without review." I stayed quiet for a second, letting her words settle, because I already knew that. I had felt it the moment it happened. I just did not have the language for it until now. I asked her one simple question: "Am I still listed as a member in the company?" And she answered without hesitation, "Yes, you are. Nothing has changed on that end." That was all I needed to hear. Everything else started to fall into place in a way that felt calm, controlled, almost quiet compared to the chaos of the morning. She suggested we meet, said she would pull the full documents and go over everything with me, not in a rush, not over the phone, but properly, the way things like this should be handled. I agreed, and we set a time for later that afternoon. I ended the call and sat there again for a moment, but this time it felt different, not like I was stuck, but like I was waiting for the next step to begin. I turned the key in the ignition and looked in the rearview mirror at my kids, who were still watching me carefully, trying to read something in my expression. "We are going to stop by a place first," I said, "then we will figure out tonight," and they nodded, trusting me the way they always had, even when things were uncertain. The drive across town gave me time to think, not about what had already happened, but about what needed to happen next, and for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about survival. I was thinking about position, about understanding where I stood in something larger than just rent and bills. The office building was smaller than I remembered, plain, practical, the kind of place people passed by without noticing, but inside, it held information that mattered more than anything else right now. When I walked in, she was already there, papers spread across the desk, organized, precise, the way someone prepares when they know a conversation is important. She looked at me for a moment, not with surprise, but with recognition, like she had been expecting this to matter eventually. We sat down and she turned the documents toward me, walking me through each part carefully, not assuming I understood, but not talking down to me either. "Your share is small," she said, "but it is real, and it gives you rights, not just passive interest." I listened closely, absorbing every word, Every explanation about how decisions were made, how management worked, how actions like eviction required proper authorization and process. The more she explained, the clearer it became that what happened this morning was not just unfair, it was outside the structure that had been put in place. I did not feel angry, not in the way I used to when things went wrong. I felt steady, grounded in something that finally made sense. I asked her what options existed, not emotionally, but practically, and she outlined them clearly: review the action, challenge the process, address the management behavior, all within the system that was already there. I nodded, not rushing, not reacting, just understanding that this moment was not about getting even, it was about correcting something that should never have happened in the first place. And as I sat there, looking at my name on those pages again, I realized something simple but powerful. I had spent years thinking I was just trying to keep a roof over our heads, but without realizing it, I had stepped into something that gave me a voice in how those roofs were managed. I did not rush anything after that meeting, even though part of me wanted to go straight back and confront him, to stand in that same hallway and let him see exactly what he had done. But I knew better now. Reacting fast had never built anything in my life. It had only made things harder. So I slowed down, listened carefully as she outlined the next steps, and made sure I understood not just what I could do, but how to do it the right way. We reviewed the lease structure, the management agreement, and the internal policies that governed how tenants were supposed to be treated, especially when it came to notices and timelines. Every line we went through added more clarity, not emotion, just clarity, and that was what I needed most. By the time I left the office, I had copies of everything organized neatly in a folder, along with a clear plan that did not involve shouting or arguing, just process, documentation, and timing. I stepped outside and took a slow breath, the late afternoon sun lower now, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and for the first time all day, I felt something close to steady. Not relief, not victory, just steady. I walked back to the car where my kids were waiting, and when I opened the door, my youngest smiled slightly, like she could feel that something had shifted even if she did not know what. "We're okay," I said quietly, and this time it was not something I was hoping for, it was something I understood. We drove to a small motel for the night, nothing fancy, just a clean room with 2 beds and a working air conditioner, but it felt different from other times we had ended up in places like this. This time it was not the end of something, it was just a pause before the next step. That evening, after the kids fell asleep, I sat at the small table near the window and went through the documents again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to be certain, every detail, every name, every clause. I drafted an email carefully, reading it over more than once before sending it, addressing the management company, outlining what had happened, attaching copies of the notice, referencing the sections that had been violated, and requesting immediate review of the situation. There was no anger in it, no accusations, just facts, clear and direct. When I hit send, I did not feel nervous, I felt prepared. The next morning, my phone rang earlier than usual, a number I recognized from the management office. I answered calmly, and the tone on the other end was already different, more careful, more aware. They acknowledged receiving my message, said they were looking into it urgently, and asked if I would be available for a meeting later that day. I agreed without hesitation, not because I needed answers anymore, but because I wanted to see how they would handle what had already been set in motion. After the call ended, I sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner, thinking about how quickly things can change when you understand where you actually stand. I was not thinking about him anymore, not about the way he spoke or the way he looked at me like I did not belong there. I was thinking about the system behind him, the structure that gave him authority, and how that same structure also set limits he had clearly ignored. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something simple but powerful. I was no longer just reacting to life as it happened. I was stepping into a position where I could shape what happened next. I arrived at the meeting 10 minutes early. Not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to sit in that space and observe, the same way I had learned to do years ago when I was cleaning empty units and listening to conversations that were not meant for me. The conference room was simple, a rectangular table, a few chairs, a window overlooking a parking lot that looked exactly like the one I had sat in the day before, and for a moment I let that thought settle. How quickly the same kind of place can feel completely different depending on where you stand in it. When they walked in, there were two of them, both from the management side, and their tone was not the same as it had been over the phone. It was more measured, more careful, like they were choosing each word before speaking it. They thanked me for coming in, acknowledged the situation, and began outlining what they had found in their initial review, and I listened without interrupting, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to hear how they would frame it. They confirmed that the notice issued to me had not followed the proper internal process, that there had been no formal review, no escalation, and no approval from the ownership group before it was delivered. It had been handled solely at the manager level, based on his own interpretation of the situation. I nodded slowly, not surprised, just taking it in, letting the facts align with what I already knew. One of them asked if I would like to share my perspective, and I did, calmly, clearly, walking them through the timeline from my side, the missed payment, the circumstances, the way the conversation had been handled, and the immediate notice without any attempt to work through the situation. I did not raise my voice, I did not exaggerate anything, I just spoke in a way that made it easy for them to see the gap between what should have happened and what actually did. There was a pause after I finished, not uncomfortable, just quiet, like everyone in the room understood that something important had been confirmed. Then they shifted the conversation, not to defend what had happened, but to address what needed to happen next. They explained that the manager's actions were already under formal review, that his authority would be temporarily suspended while they completed their internal process, and that any decisions regarding my lease would be handled directly through the ownership structure moving forward. I listened carefully, noticing how the language had changed, how the situation was no longer being framed as a tenant issue, but as a management failure. That distinction mattered more than anything else. They asked what outcome I was looking for, and I thought about that for a moment, not emotionally, not in terms of what felt good, but in terms of what made sense. I told them I was not there to create conflict, I was there to ensure that the process worked the way it was designed to, for me and for anyone else who might find themselves in the same position. I said I expected the notice to be formally withdrawn, my lease to remain in place under the correct terms, and a clear review of how situations like this would be handled going forward. There was no hesitation in their response. They agreed, noted everything down, and confirmed that I would receive written documentation by the end of the day. When the meeting ended, I stood up slowly, gathered my folder, and walked out without rushing, without looking back, because I did not need to. As I stepped outside, the air felt warmer than it had the day before, or maybe it was just that I was standing in a different place now, not physically, but in a way that changed everything about how the same world felt around me. I did not go back to the apartment that day, not immediately, not because I could not, but because I wanted to wait until everything was finalized the right way. By the time I returned to the motel, the email they promised was already there, clear, formal, and exactly. As discussed, the notice had been withdrawn, my lease was reinstated under proper terms, and all further communication would go through the ownership review process until further notice. I read it twice, not out of doubt, but to let it settle fully, to understand that this was not temporary, not uncertain, it was real and documented. I closed my phone and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of my kids in the room, a cartoon playing low on the television, the air conditioner humming steadily, and for the first time in a long while, nothing felt like it was about to fall apart. The next morning, we packed our things again, but this time it did not feel rushed or forced. It felt controlled, like we were moving forward instead of being pushed out. When we arrived back at the building, everything looked exactly the same from the outside, the same parking lot, the same doors, the same hallway. But I noticed something else, something small but important. The tone had changed. The front office door was open, and someone new was sitting at the desk, not the man from before, and when she looked up, her expression was professional, calm, and aware, like she already knew who I was before I said anything. "Good morning," she said, standing slightly as I approached. "We have been expecting you." I nodded, returning the greeting without saying much, because I did not need to explain anything. Everything that mattered had already been communicated through the right channels. She handed me a printed copy of the updated documents, along with a brief summary of the changes, and I reviewed them quickly, not because I doubted them, but because I had learned that understanding the details was what made the difference between being part of something and being controlled by it. Everything matched what had been sent the day before, clear, precise, and in line with the structure I now understood much better. I signed where needed, kept my copy, and thanked her before heading down the hallway toward our unit. As I walked, I noticed how different it felt this time. Not physically, the walls were the same, the carpet still worn in places, but internally, it was completely different. I was not walking back into a place I was afraid to lose. I was stepping into something I had a role in, something I understood in a way I never had before. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my kids followed closely, their energy lighter now, their voices already filling the space again as they moved toward their rooms. I stood there for a second, just inside the doorway, looking around at the same furniture, the same walls, the same small details that had always been there, and I realized how much of my life had been shaped by not knowing where I stood in things. That had changed. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because I had taken the time to understand what was already mine to begin with. Later that afternoon, as I was putting things back in place, my phone rang again, and when I answered, the voice on the other end was one I recognized immediately, slower this time, more careful and very different from the first time I had heard it. I listened quietly, not interrupting, not reacting, just letting him speak, because this time I did not need to say much at all. He spoke for longer than I expected, his voice slower now, measured, almost careful in a way that felt completely different from the man who had stood in that hallway just days before. He said there had been a misunderstanding, that things had moved too quickly, that procedures were not followed the way they should have been, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed with everything he said, but because I no longer needed to react to it. I had already seen what mattered, and it was not in his explanation, it was in the structure behind him that had already corrected what he tried to do. When he finished, there was a brief pause, like he was waiting for something, maybe a response, maybe a reaction, something to fill the space he had left open. I did not give him that. I simply said, the situation has been reviewed, and it has already been addressed through the proper channels, and I let the words sit there, calm, clear, without any extra weight added to them. There was another pause on his end, shorter this time, and then he acknowledged it, quietly, almost like he was adjusting to a reality he had not expected. He mentioned that he would no longer be directly handling matters related to my unit, that someone else from the office would be taking over, and again, I did not react. I simply said I understood. The conversation ended not with tension, not with conflict, but with something quieter, something that felt like a shift more than anything else. I set my phone down on the table and looked around the room again, the same space that had felt uncertain just days ago now carrying a different kind of weight, not heavy, just stable. I went back to what I had been doing, putting things back in place, organizing small details, folding clothes, moving through the routine that had always grounded me no matter what was happening around me. But even in those simple actions, there was something new, something subtle but undeniable. I was not just maintaining a space anymore, I was aware of my position within it. Later that evening, after everything was settled and the day had slowed down, I sat by the window and looked out at the parking lot below, watching people come and go, cars pulling in, doors opening and closing. The quiet rhythm of everyday life continuing as it always does. I thought about how many people in that building were going through their own versions of uncertainty, their own moments of not knowing where they stood, and I realized how easy it is to stay in that place when you never stop to understand the system around you. I had spent years thinking my role was limited to what I could see directly, to the bills I paid, the work I did, the space I occupied, but there had always been another layer, something deeper that I had stepped into without fully recognizing it at the time. And now that I saw it clearly, it changed the way everything felt, not just this situation, but the way I looked at every part of my life moving forward. I did not feel like I had won anything, not in the way people usually describe it. There was no moment of celebration, no dramatic turning point, just a quiet understanding that I had crossed from one side of something into another. The next morning, as I got the kids ready for school and moved through the same routine that had always defined our days, I noticed how steady everything felt, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because I was no longer standing on uncertain ground. And as I locked the door behind us and walked down the same hallway again, I did not feel like someone passing through anymore. I felt like someone who understood exactly where she stood, and that made all the difference. Life did not suddenly become easier after that. The bills were still there, the early mornings still came too fast, and the routine of working, planning, and taking care of my kids did not change overnight. But something inside me had shifted in a way that made everything feel different, not lighter, but clearer. I stopped moving through my days like I was just trying to keep up, and started paying attention to how things actually worked around me, not just in that building, but everywhere. The way agreements were structured, the way decisions were made, the way people assumed authority without always understanding its limits. I began to see patterns that I had never noticed before, small details that most people ignored because they were too busy reacting to whatever was right in front of them. And once you start seeing those things, it becomes harder to go back to not knowing. A few weeks later, I found myself back at the same office, not because there was a problem this time, but because I had asked for a follow-up meeting, not out of necessity, but out of intention. I sat down with the same woman who had helped me before, and this time the conversation felt different from the start, not reactive, not focused on fixing something, but on understanding what could come next. She walked me through the current position of the property, the performance, the structure of the ownership group, and how opportunities like this could grow if approached the right way. I listened carefully, not overwhelmed the way I might have been before, but focused, asking questions when something was not clear, taking notes, making sure I understood not just the situation, but the possibilities. It was not about becoming something overnight, not about chasing a quick change. It was about recognizing that I had already taken a step into something larger, and now I had a choice to either ignore it again or build on it intentionally. When I left that meeting, I did not feel like someone who had just resolved a problem. I felt like someone who had just found a direction. Back at home, I continued the same routines that had always defined our life, making dinner, helping with homework, getting everything ready for the next day, but there was a quiet confidence in those moments now. Something steady that did not depend on things going perfectly. I knew that not everything would be easy, that setbacks would still come, but I also knew that I was no longer standing on uncertain ground, waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. Months passed, and small changes began to take shape, more understanding, better decisions, careful steps that built on each other without rushing. I did not tell many people about what had happened, not because I was hiding it, but because it was not something I needed to prove. It was something I needed to live out in my own way. And sometimes, when I walked through that same hallway at the end of a long day, keys in my hand, kids laughing behind me, I would pause for just a second, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. There was a time when I thought I was just trying to hold on to a place in the world, just trying to keep a roof over our heads and make it through the next month. But that was never the whole story. The truth was, even in the hardest moments, I had been stepping into something more, learning things I did not realize I would need, building something I could not fully see yet. And now, standing there in that same space, I understood it clearly. I was never just passing through. I was becoming someone who knew exactly where she stood, and that made all the difference.